My last build was a large dining table. I really enjoyed working on it, but it was kind of a bear to build, so I'm glad my next project is something smaller. The only requirements for this piece were, it needed to be a C table, made from a medium to dark wood, and of course, a cool design, maybe with a beach theme. If you're not familiar, a C table is a side table shaped like a C so it can slide under a couch or a chair. Like these. I'm building it for a beach house, so the ocean was a natural design thing. This is what I came up with. Of course, the name really wrote itself. Just because this is a smaller build doesn't mean it's simple. It has miters, which are weirdly difficult, and wood bending. I also played around with the design after I started the build and came up with a little different look. I'd love for you to tell me which of the two options you prefer. I was able to build this entire table from about half of one 8/4 board. This piece of cherry has been in my shop for about 3 years. So I laid out all the parts for the base, top, and waves according to my cut list. Then I jointed one face on each board. I left a little extra length on one end of each board. This helps me control snipe when I plane the boards. By chasing the boards in one after the other, I only get snipe on the start of the first board and the end of the second one. First up, we need to make the curved pieces, the waves, if you will. They look like this. Actually, first we need to create the clamping forms we'll use to bend wood into this shape. So I created a pattern in Shaper 3D and printed it out. Then cut it out and glued it to a scrap of 1/4-inch plywood. Then I rough cut the shape out at the bandsaw and cleaned it up on the spindle sander. Next, I traced the entire shape on a larger piece of 1/4-inch plywood. This is the full wave template. You might be thinking, why not just print out the whole shape and cut it out and sand it all at once rather than creating a small part of the pattern first? Basically, it's easier to get this small part close to perfect. If you did the entire shape, you'd have to cut out and sand all 3 curves at one time, so it would be much harder to keep them all consistent. For a simple shape like this one, it's probably not that big of a deal, but that's why I did it this way. Once the shape was rough cut out, I stuck the pattern onto it with double-sided tape. And cleaned it up at the router table using a flush trim bit. I noticed in this build how much I use tape, especially double-sided tape. I know a lot of people use blue tape and CA glue instead, and I've done that too at times, but you just can't beat really good double-sided tape. This isn't sponsored or anything, but I'll put a link in the description to the tape I use. So next, I needed to cut a complementary curve on another piece of 1/4-inch ply. I stuck the wave template onto the larger piece of ply. Then I ripped the opposing edge so it would be parallel to the edge of the wave template. Then I used the same flush trim bit from earlier and I routed a complementary curve. It's important to keep pressure on the wave template so the cut remains clean. Now that the templates are done, I can build the actual bending forms. I'm making them out of 3/4-inch MDF, so I cut out 6 parts, 3 for the top and 3 for the bottom. Then I trace the full wave template onto 3 of them, and the full complementary template onto the other 3. Then I rough cut them at the bandsaw and clean them up using the templates and a flush trim bit. Next, I glued the parts together. After they dried, I cut pieces of 1/4-inch plywood to attach to the bottom. This just gives them some protection from the clamps since MDF can be brittle sometimes. Next, I added cork to the clamping faces. So I mentioned I'm using bent lamination to make the waves. So what is that? Well, basically, I want my waves for this piece to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. If I just cut strips that were that thick and tried to bend them into this shape, they would break. So instead, I use 4 strips that are each a 1/16 of an inch thick, thin enough that they'll be able to bend without breaking. So I spread glue between them and clamp them into the forms. Once the glue dries, the piece will stay in that shape. So that's how it works. All right, let's make some waves. So first up, I need to resaw a bunch of thin strips. As I said, I want them to be just over a 1/16 of an inch thick when they're done, so I shoot for 3/32 off the bandsaw. After I cut one strip from each of the 2 boards, I run that face through the planer. Then repeat the process until I can't cut any more strips. I got a total of 8 strips from each board, with enough left over to get 2 more if needed. So now we've got all of our strips resawed to about 3/32 of an inch, and we need to get them all down to 1/16 of an inch. That'll make them thin enough that they'll bend properly when we get to that step in a few minutes. The best way to do that is with a drum sander. Well, actually, the best way to do it is probably with a wide belt sander, but I don't have one of those. I do have a drum sander, and that's probably how I'm going to do this ultimately. But not everybody has a drum sander or a wide belt sander, so probably the next best option is to use your planer, but there are some issues. So first is you can't normally put, a 3/32 piece of wood through a planer. The head won't go down that close to the bed. It just won't work. The way you fix that is you use basically a sled. You use a piece for the strips to ride on. The second issue is that even if you do that, because the strips are so thin, it's possible that when they get under the cutters, it'll pull them up into the head and they'll basically shatter the ends. So I probably wouldn't try this with a straight head planer. I'd probably only try this with a helical head or a spiral head, which is what this is. But your results may vary. So we'll try one. We'll try one on the using the planer method, and we'll see how it works. And then after that, we may do the rest of them that way, or we'll switch over to drum sander if we don't like the results. I'm just using a sheet of melamine here as the base. So I clamped it to the infeed table. Then I just kept running the piece through, taking the smallest cut possible and checking the thickness often. So that actually worked a lot better than I thought it would. It was only one piece, but I'm shooting for a thickness of 0.65. See if you can see it. The reality is the planer is a lot faster than a drum sander. If you've ever used a drum sander, you know they can be maddeningly slow. If you go too fast, if you take too deep of a cut, you get burning on the wood. The paper gets gummed up. It's a real mess. So you have to go really slow. Whereas the planer obviously can do it a lot quicker. So yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and do it with the planer. I spent some time arranging the strips to get the best faces facing out. I also alternated the board direction because I've read that that can help keep them stable. No idea if that's true or not, but I don't think it can hurt. Each of these strips is wide enough to get 2 waves plus a little extra. So I glued up 4 strips in total. Then, I lay out the clamping forms with the glued up strips between them. Then, I slowly increase the clamp pressure until there are no gaps. As you can see, the forms shifted a little during clamp up. I let the glue cure for a full 24 hours. Then I unclamped the forms to see how the first lamination turned out. Overall, it came out okay in that the shape of the piece is right and there was very little springback. The shift in the clamps did cause the pieces to move, so I won't be able to get 2 full waves out of this piece. Luckily, I only need 7 in total, so I should be okay. I decided I needed to do something to the clamping form to keep it from sliding around under pressure. So I just glued on some alignment pieces. Then I glued up the second set of strips and clamped it into the form. The alignment braces did a great job, and things came out much better. I guess bent laminations are kind of like pancakes. The first one is usually ugly. Now I need to rip each wave into 2 pieces. First, I want to joint one edge. Because these pieces are thin and weirdly shaped, it would be dangerous to do this on the joiner. So I decided I'd make a sled for the table saw instead. It's just a 3/4 inch piece of MDF with the edges ripped parallel. So I used double-sided tape to attach each wave to the edge, and then ran it through the saw to create one clean jointed edge. Then I added a fence to the sled, set back 3/4 of an inch from the edge. Then I taped each piece up against the fence and cut them each to 3/4 of an inch wide. Finally, I just cross-cut the edges so they were all the same length. Now it's time to cut those miters I mentioned earlier. I have a decent miter gauge for my table saw. But when cutting longer boards at a 45-degree angle, it gets a little tippy. So I find it's easier to just make a quick miter sled. I just cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and leave the table saw fence where it is. Then I screw a fence onto the board, setting it to 45 degrees from the ripped edge. Next, I measure the length of cut I'm trying to make and stick a piece of wood onto the sled as a stop. Then I clamp the board to the fence and make the cut. Next, I need to cut tapers onto the top supports. I just mark the line and then rough cut them at the bandsaw. Then I clamp them in the vise together and plane them until they're even and smooth. The whole base is held together with dominoes. I cut all the mortises. And then test fit to make sure everything is tight and square. Then I measure for the wave supports. I sneak up on the cut until I get a nice fit. Then I rip the piece in half to get 2 supports. And finally, I use the domino trim stop to cut the mortises in the ends of the supports. Next, I route a round over onto the tapered top supports. This would be a really tricky cut since the piece is so small. So I use double-sided tape to attach the supports to a larger support piece. Finally, I drilled countersunk holes, which I'll use later to attach the top to the base. Now it was time to glue up the leg assemblies. Once they were dry, I sanded them. I added some blue tape to remind me where not to route when I do the roundovers later. Then I cut domino mortises in the sides of the legs. Next, I routed a round over on all the edges, being sure to avoid those blue taped areas from earlier. Those will get round overs once the entire base is assembled. Adding a small round over to the wave supports is also tricky, but clamping a trim router into the vise actually works really well, though it does look a little sketchy. Now I glue up the entire base. Once it's dry, I remove the blue tape and round over the remaining areas. Then I sand the whole thing to ensure all the transitions are smooth. Part of the board I'm using had a nice strip of sapwood along one edge. I decided this would add some interest to the top. So I resawed the top piece in half so I could get a book match which would put the sapwood in the center. My cut was pretty dead center, so there wasn't a whole lot of sanding to do. I just ran the parts through the drum sander a couple of times. Then I jointed the edges. And glued them up. Once dry, I scraped the glue squeeze out and sanded them to 180 grit. Then I trimmed the top to length. If you watched my last video, you know I like jigs. Well, I knew I had a corner rounding jig somewhere, I just had to dig it out. Then I cut the corners and routed the curve onto them. And finally sanded the edges. So I put down some tape that's the exact distance of these two supports for the waves. That makes it easier to lay things out without having to try to do it on the base. It's a good idea to number your waves so you don't make any mistakes. So I'm just going to number them on the front here, starting from the left with number 1. Okay, so the next step is we want to basically lay these out in the offset pattern that we want, and then cut the top and the bottom so that they're all even at that position. What we're going to do is take a double square set to 7/8 of an inch, and we're going to start on the top or on the left-hand side with wave number 1, offset each wave by 7/8 of an inch like this. So at the end we have, a pattern that kind of looks like this. The easiest way I found to do this is use tape. Otherwise you chase it all over the place trying to hold it in place. So start by putting a piece of tape on number 1 and get number 2 in the right place, and then run the tape over number 2. So now those two are locked in place. Then number 3. Then I just centered the whole thing between the wave supports and struck a line on each end. Then I cross-cut the pieces at the table saw. And finally sanded all of the waves. This next step is completely optional. I'm going to cut notches into the wave supports to position each of the waves. I add some double-sided tape to each wave support. Then I use handy shims to set each wave into place with the proper spacing. You could just glue and pin nail the waves into place, but the notches give them some mechanical support. Then I used a marking knife to mark a line on either side of each wave. Then I removed the waves and peeled off the tape, leaving only the pieces that fall in between the waves. This gives me the locations for the notches I need to cut, which I did using the table saw. My go-to finish is a hard wax oil. So first, I clean all the parts with raw wood cleaner. Notice that I taped off the glue areas on the wave supports and the ends of the waves. I'm not even done yet, and I've used tape 16 times in this build. Next, I applied the hard wax oil with a white non-abrasive pad. After about 15 minutes, I wipe off all the excess using blue shop towels. I think the stripe down the middle of the top makes it look like a vintage surfboard. That's the look I was going for anyway. I let it cure for 48 hours. Then I used a maroon abrasive pad to rough up all of the parts. Wiped off all the dust, then applied a second coat in the same way as the first. Now all that's left to do is attach the top to the base. I just want to take a minute to say thank you for watching my video. I didn't know what to expect when I put my first one out there a month ago, but I have been overwhelmed by the amount of positive and supportive comments I've received. And I am completely blown away by the likes and subscribes and views. So seriously, thank you. Now that the table is done, I can show you the two options. As you've seen throughout the video, the original design has the waves lined up, I guess you'd call it linearly. When I first assembled it this way, I liked it, but then I started playing around with the waves and I realized I also liked the way it looked when they were lined up kind of randomly. So anyway, I'm anxious to hear what you think. If you like the original design better, add a comment starting with the word linear. And if you like the second one better, add a comment starting with the word random. And click the like button too so I'll know you voted. Ultimately, the customer chose their favorite, so that's how I finished it. But I'm not going to tell you what they picked. For science. Just kidding. They picked this one. I treated myself after finishing this build. I got some more tape.